There's a pattern in history that has destroyed the world's greatest industrial powers, one by one, over the last 80 years. And right now in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, decision by decision. After 1945, Great Britain went from a victorious global empire to a bankrupt debtor nation in less than 30 years, its industrial heartland hollowed out completely. In the 1950s, Detroit was the undisputed engine of the global economy, but its complacency led to an urban collapse so total that 40 square miles of the city became vacant land. The American Rust Belt went from the most prosperous industrial region on Earth to a landscape of shuttered factories and broken communities. 3 times, 3 industrial giants, 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United States has already completed the first 3 stages of the pattern. We're not approaching the decline. We're deep inside it. This is the story of industrial sclerosis, why every empire thinks it's different, and why the math says we're next. This is the lore of money. We explore how money shapes history, power, and society. Subscribe for more? Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what industrial collapse actually looks like. Not in textbooks, but in practice. Collapse doesn't start with a foreign invasion or a stock market crash. It starts with a slow, invisible hardening of the economic arteries. It starts with the complacency that comes from being number one for too long. At first, the decline is completely invisible. The stock market might hit new highs and the headlines will celebrate national strength. But beneath the surface, the foundations are cracking as long-term investment is sacrificed for short-term gains and comfortable stability. Then comes the acceleration. A global crisis or a new competitor arrives, and what was once a slow decay suddenly becomes a cascading failure, a death spiral that feeds on itself until there's nothing left to save. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Great Britain and the American Rust Belt. Let's look at how it actually happened twice before in the exact same way. Our first case study begins in the rubble of World War II, with an empire that won the war but lost everything else. Great Britain emerged victorious, but it was a Pyrrhic victory that left it financially vanquished. The cost of fighting the war had been so staggering that it accelerated a decline that had already been quietly underway for decades. In one swift, brutal conflict, Britain was transformed from the world's leading creditor nation into a debtor on the verge of total bankruptcy. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. Britain's national debt peaked at an astronomical 252% of its entire economy. To fund the war, the government had been forced to liquidate a tenth of the nation's foreign assets, a critical source of income that had propped up its finances for a century. The country was so broke that it was completely dependent on American financial aid, first through a massive 50-year loan and then through the Marshall Plan. These were essential lifelines, but they came with conditions that cemented Britain's new subordinate role in the world. This created a strange paradox, the burdens of the victor. Unlike defeated nations like Germany and Japan, whose factories were bombed into oblivion and subsequently rebuilt from scratch with the latest, most efficient technology, Britain was saddled with the liabilities of its victory. First, it had the ongoing costs of maintaining a sprawling, crumbling global empire. Second, and more importantly, it was left with a vast but aging industrial plant that had been run into the ground to fuel the war machine. There was no clean slate. There was only the immense challenge of trying to modernize an exhausted and obsolete industrial base while servicing a mountain of debt. In this sense, the very fact that Britain survived with its empire and industry intact became the primary driver of its long-term decline. In the wake of the war, a powerful political consensus emerged in Britain, driven by the collective memory of the Great Depression. The landslide election of Clement Attlee's Labour government ushered in an era defined by a single ambitious goal: the creation of a comprehensive cradle-to-grave welfare state. This project, epitomized by the founding of the National Health Service in 1948 to provide free health care for all, represented a conscious societal choice. The nation prioritized social security and full employment over the aggressive capital reinvestment needed to modernize its industrial core. It chose to build a new Jerusalem at the expense of its workshops. To achieve these social goals, the government nationalized key sectors of the economy, including coal mining, railways, and heavy industry. But this wasn't a strategic move to foster innovation. Many of these industries were already failing and unprofitable, which meant nationalization was a defensive measure to prevent collapse and mass unemployment. This policy was explicitly designed to keep joblessness low, which was socially commendable, but it meant propping up inefficient, overmanned industries. It discouraged the painful but necessary reallocation of labor from dying sectors to emerging ones. This vast expansion of the state was funded by a huge increase in taxation, diverting a substantial pool of capital that might otherwise have been available for private industrial investment. The combination of these factors fostered a political and economic culture of managed decline. The national objective shifted from fostering dynamic growth to managing the slow, steady erosion of Britain's traditional industries. The goal became stability, not creative destruction, and that mindset ultimately led to decades of stagnation. Beneath these macroeconomic choices lay a deep-seated failure within British industry itself. A chronic lack of investment, a reluctance to adopt new technologies, and a complacent management culture left British manufacturing vulnerable. The British economy developed a peculiar imbalance where capital was increasingly skewed toward the pursuit of short-term returns in the financial sector. The City of London, rather than long-term industrial projects. This capital starvation created a tangible technological lag. The once dominant British cotton industry failed to adopt more efficient ring spinning and automatic looms. The dye-stuff industry hesitated to capitalize on new synthetic chemical processes that were invented in Britain but more aggressively commercialized in Germany. What little research and development existed was overwhelmingly directed toward military applications, leaving commercial innovation underfunded. This growing disconnect between Britain's world-class financial sector and its domestic manufacturing base proved to be a critical structural flaw. The City of London became more global in its orientation, channeling capital and talent into international finance, rather than into modernizing factories in the industrial Midlands or the north of England. This created a dual economy, a prosperous, high-finance hub in London, and a steadily decaying industrial heartland everywhere else, exacerbating regional inequalities that persist to this day. As Britain's captive colonial markets dissolved with the end of empire, and as competition from a rebuilt Europe and a rising Japan intensified, these deep-rooted weaknesses were laid bare. The nation's trade surplus in manufactured goods, a cornerstone of its 19th-century power, shrank steadily before turning into a persistent and structural deficit in the early 1980s. The long sunset was complete. Our second case study begins not in the rubble of decline, but at the peak of industrial power. The deindustrialization of the American Rust Belt is often dated to the economic shocks of the 1970s, but its true origins lie 2 decades earlier, in the seemingly triumphant golden age of the 1950s. It was during this period of unparalleled market dominance that the region's key industries, particularly Detroit's Big Three automakers, developed a deep-seated complacency that sowed the seeds of their eventual collapse. In the immediate post-war decades, the Rust Belt's industrial giants faced virtually no competition. With Europe and Japan still recovering, American auto, steel, and tire producers commanded market shares as high as 90%. This monopolistic position allowed them to charge high prices and agree to generous labor contracts without any fear of being undercut. Powerful unions like the United Auto Workers secured high wages and comprehensive benefits, creating a prosperous industrial middle class. But this also led to an uncompetitive cost structure. This prosperity, however, was built on a fragile foundation. Sheltered from competition, these companies had little reason to pursue costly and disruptive innovations. Labor productivity growth in the region averaged only about 2% per year, compared with nearly 3% in the rest of the United States. The industry was slow to adopt the latest technologies. This period of market dominance masked deep structural weaknesses, a reality that became brutally apparent when conditions changed. The oil crises of the 1970s triggered a dramatic shift in consumer demand towards smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles, a market that Japanese and German automakers were perfectly positioned to fill. Detroit's Big Three, accustomed to selling large, high-margin cars, were slow to react, losing significant market share from which they would never fully recover. The Golden Age, therefore, was not the opposite of the decline. It was its direct cause. The decline of the Rust Belt was not merely an industrial story. It was a story of urban disintegration. A symbiotic collapse occurred. where industrial decentralization and profound social fragmentation reinforced one another in a devastating feedback loop that hollowed out the region's great cities, with Detroit as the prime example. The process began with a technological shift. The old multi-story factories in dense urban centers became inefficient. Companies sought to build sprawling, single-story plants that required vast tracts of land, which were only available in the suburbs. This industrial exodus began in earnest after the war. Between 1947 and 1963 alone, the city of Detroit lost approximately 150,000 manufacturing jobs to its surrounding suburbs. This corporate migration was inseparable from the social and racial dynamics of the era. As factories relocated, a white flight of middle and working-class white families followed the jobs to the suburbs. At the same time, African-American workers, who had migrated to cities like Detroit in huge numbers for those well-paying auto jobs, were often systematically barred from these same suburbs through discriminatory housing practices. This effectively trapped a large and increasingly impoverished black population in the inner city, while the economic base and the wealthiest taxpayers departed. The consequences for the city were catastrophic. Detroit's population plummeted by over 60% from its peak in 1950, falling from the fourth largest city in the U.S. to the 27th. This mass exodus created a fiscal death spiral. The erosion of the tax base left the city starved of revenue, leading to a collapse in essential public services like policing, sanitation, and education. Decaying infrastructure and rising crime rates then accelerated the flight of remaining residents and businesses, further shrinking the tax base. This process left behind a landscape of unparalleled urban decay. By 2012, nearly a third of Detroit's total land area, 40 square miles, was vacant, a testament to the symbiotic collapse of an industry and the city it had built. The structural weaknesses and social fractures that developed in the post-war decades made the Rust Belt acutely vulnerable to the perfect storm of economic forces that converged in the 1970s and 1980s. Globalization, technological change, and domestic policy decisions combined to deliver a series of devastating blows. The rise of global competition was the most visible force. For the first time, American manufacturers faced intense pressure from lower-cost producers, particularly in Asia. The steel crisis saw U.S. steel undercut by more efficient and cheaper production from Japan and Germany. At the same time, domestic policy choices amplified these global pressures. The Volcker shock of the early 1980s, a decision by the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to combat inflation, caused the U.S. dollar to appreciate sharply. This made American exports significantly more expensive on the world market while making imported goods much cheaper for American consumers, dealing a double blow to domestic manufacturers. Finally, the relentless march of automation and new manufacturing methods meant that even in the factories that remained, fewer workers were needed. This combination of foreign competition, a strong dollar, and labor-saving technology proved to be a fatal cocktail for the old industrial heartland. When examined side by side, the declines of post-war Britain and the American Rust Belt reveal a shared DNA of industrial decay. They lay out a clear four-stage pattern of collapse. The first stage is the inertia of success. Both Britain, as the world's first industrial nation, and the Rust Belt, as the champion of post-war manufacturing, suffered from a deep-seated complacency born of past triumphs. This success bred a resistance to change, leading to chronic underinvestment in new technologies and production methods. They believed their dominance was permanent, which left them vulnerable to hungrier competitors. The second stage is the development of powerful but inflexible structures. In both Britain's nationalized industries and the Rust Belt's auto and steel sectors, powerful institutions secured admirable conditions for their members. But this strength eventually translated into rigid markets, resistance to productivity-enhancing changes, and high-cost structures that became unsustainable in a competitive global environment. The third stage is the Great Revealer. The intense pressures of international competition that mounted from the 1970s onward did not in themselves cause the decline. Rather, they acted as a tidal wave that mercilessly exposed and exploited the pre-existing weaknesses, the technological lag, the high costs, the lack of innovation, that had been allowed to fester for decades behind protective walls. Globalization didn't create the rot, it just revealed it to the world. The fourth and final stage is deepening regional inequality. In both cases, the economic pain was not distributed evenly. It was intensely concentrated in specific geographical areas. This created a stark and lasting divide between prosperous, dynamic, service-oriented regions, like London or the coastal tech hubs, and the struggling, left-behind former industrial heartlands. This geographical schism has had profound and enduring social and political consequences, fueling resentment and political polarization that continues to shape both nations today. That is the pattern. Now let's apply this diagnostic toolkit to the contemporary United States. When we do, a disturbing picture emerges. The same pathologies that precipitated those earlier declines are now evident at a national level. First, let's look at fiscal policy. Just as Britain was crushed by the financial weight of its victory, the United States now labors under a fiscal burden of its own making. The U.S. national debt is on a trajectory that is widely acknowledged as unsustainable. The Congressional Budget Office projects that federal debt held by the public will soon surpass the historic high set in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The federal budget deficit for this fiscal year alone is estimated to be $1.8 trillion, the result of structural imbalances between spending and revenue. This enormous and growing debt acts as a silent tax on the future, constraining our ability to make critical long-term investments in infrastructure, education, and research. It's a fiscal straitjacket identical to the one that paralyzed British policymaking for a generation. The inertia of success manifests as a belief that we can borrow forever without consequence. Check. Second, industrial hollowing. Britain's decline was marked by the erosion of its manufacturing base. The U.S. now exhibits a similar pattern, evidenced by a massive and persistent trade deficit. For decades, America has consumed far more than it produces. While recent policies have aimed to reshore manufacturing, their effects have been complex and often counterproductive. Tariffs intended to protect domestic industries have frequently raised input costs for other American manufacturers, making them less competitive. This suggests a long-term erosion of the nation's productive capacity, a key symptom of the British disease. Inflexible structures that are difficult to reform. Check. Third, social fragility. The deep regional and social divisions that characterize the decline of both the UK and Detroit are now writ large across the United States. The nation is experiencing a dramatic divergence in economic outcomes, creating a two Americas reality. Between 2020 and 2025, the top 0.1% of Americans nearly doubled their wealth, while the bottom 50% saw only marginal gains. This chasm is fueling profound political instability, paralyzing the system and making it nearly impossible to build the consensus needed to address fundamental national challenges. Deepening regional inequality, check. And finally, economic dependence. Detroit's fatal flaw was its over-reliance on a single industry. Many analysts now argue that the entire U.S. economy is becoming dangerously dependent on a narrow slice of hyperproductive activity. National GDP figures are propped up by the performance of the tech and finance sectors, which are geographically concentrated in a handful of states. Meanwhile, vast swathes of the country and the bottom 60% of the population struggle with stagnant productivity and low wages. This creates a fragile economic structure where the prosperity of the entire nation hinges on the continued success of a small elite. This is the vulnerability of a one-industry town now scaled up to the national level. The most alarming aspect is not the presence of any one of these symptoms, but their convergence. The pathologies are mutually reinforcing. High national debt constrains investment in the industrial base. A weakened industrial base worsens the trade deficit, which contributes to national debt. Widening inequality, fueled by the gains of a narrow economic sector, drives the political polarization that prevents any meaningful action. This creates a national-level feedback loop of decline, a chilling echo of the symbiotic collapse that brought Detroit to its knees. Of course, the United States still possesses formidable strengths. It remains the global leader in technological innovation. The unique status of the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency grants the nation an exorbitant privilege, allowing it to sustain deficits that would trigger a crisis in any other country. And the U.S. economy is lauded for its dynamism and entrepreneurial culture. But these strengths may not be the impenetrable shield they once were. The much-hoped-for manufacturing renaissance remains elusive. Federal Reserve data from 2025 paints a picture of a sector struggling with flat or even contracting activity in various regions. Industrial production has shown only tepid growth, with little evidence of a broad-based resurgence. The U.S. economy is navigating a minefield of significant risks, including trade wars, high levels of corporate and household debt, and extreme policy uncertainty. American resilience is real, but it is being tested by a confluence of structural weaknesses that bear an uncomfortable resemblance to the historical precedents of decline. The next stage of the pattern is the external shock, the great revealer that transforms slow decay into rapid collapse. The United States is at a critical inflection point. The choices made in the coming years will determine whether the nation succumbs to the historical pattern or engineers a renewal. The most crucial lesson from Britain and the Rust Belt is the paramount importance of human capital. The ability of communities to recover was directly linked to their educational and research institutions. A successful American renewal cannot be based solely on industrial subsidies. It requires a sustained national commitment to strengthening the entire educational pipeline to equip citizens for a technology-driven economy. Two industrial giants, two complete collapses. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed they were different. Each believed the rules didn't apply to them. They were wrong every single time. We're telling ourselves the same lies right now. But the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot run up infinite debt without consequence. You cannot hollow out your productive capacity and expect to remain strong. You cannot avoid a systemic crisis once the feedback loops of decline are locked in. The sequence is already in motion. The only question is timing. Maybe we have another decade. Maybe we have less. But the pattern says a reckoning is coming. And when it comes, it won't be slow. It'll be sudden. A financial crisis, a geopolitical shock, or a technological disruption will act as the great revealer, and the illusion of strength will evaporate overnight. Twice before it has happened this way. The pattern says we're next. If this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the sequence, subscribe, because when the next stage hits, you'll want to understand what happened and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, and I'll show you where to look.